to stop on that surah and start our class for the day. So our class for today, going back to discussing Surah, wa alaikum salam, wa alaikum salam, wa rahmatullah. Our class for today and for the last couple of days and probably for quite a few days in the foreseeable future is discussing Surah Ar-Rahman, the 55th Surah in the Quran. That's what we've been discussing the last few days. This is, I think, our third day talking about it. And just the more deeply I dig into it, the deeper I see the concepts in it, and I want to spend more time with it. So originally we were going to cover some highlights from it in just like 3 days, but the more I dig into each ayah, the deeper I see how each ayah can go, and the more I want to spend time on this surah. So we're going to probably spend a little bit of time on this surah every day, inshallah, at 2 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. So just to recap before we start the next ayah that we're going to go into, I want to recap where we left off at, what we covered so far. For sure. Wa alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah. Doing good. So let me recap where we covered up to so far. So we got up to the 5th verse yesterday. So the first 5 verses: Ar-Rahman, allama al-Quran, khalaqa al-insan, allamahu al-bayan, ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bi-husban. So we talked about Ar-Rahman, and we discussed some of the meanings of Ar-Rahman, some of the potential meanings in the Quran of Ar-Rahman. We discussed allama al-Quran. SubhanAllah, thank you. We discussed allama al-Quran. What does it mean that he taught the Quran? And we discussed what does it mean, why does he say he taught the Quran without making another object, meaning who did he teach the Quran to? Why did he make it in such a general way like that? He taught the Quran without specifying. And we talked about that. Allama al-Quran, khalaqa al-insan, he created the human being. Allamahu al-bayan, he taught him al-bayan, the ability to communicate, the means of communication. Ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bi-husban was the ayat that we covered yesterday. The sun and the moon are bi-husban. Bi-husban meaning exact accounting and calculations and exact mathematics and exactly planned out in a precise, meticulous way that follows meticulous laws and principles. We studied the word husban yesterday, which comes from hasiba, which from looking in certain verses in the Quran, we concluded that hasiba doesn't just mean, like in some verses, they use the word account, or sometimes they translate as to think, but or sometimes they translate it as sufficient, like when we say hasbi Allah, they say sufficient is Allah for me. But in our discussion of this word husban, hasiba, we could see from certain verses that perhaps what this word means is to calculate, right? To calculate, like mathematically. So when we say hasbi Allah, meaning Allah is my calculation, that's who I put in my calculation. So that's a summary of what we talked about yesterday. I know that doesn't cover every single thing that we talked about. So if you missed yesterday's class, inshallah, maybe soon I'll make a separate video summarizing some of the concepts that we already covered and like maybe upload it on YouTube. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And that way, whoever missed other parts of the class can go watch that video to catch up. Wa alaikum salam. Maybe that's something I'll work on today, actually, inshallah. So we're going to come to the 6th verse. But the fifth verse, ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bi-husban, the sun and the moon are bi-husban, in exact calculations, is going to still play into our discussion today because these are going to be connected, and I'm going to show you why. So the next verse 6 says, وَالنَّجَمُ وَالشَّجَرُ يَسْجُدَانِ Wa alaikum salam. I feel like I got it. I had a piece there on my tongue. وَالنَّجَمُ وَالشَّجَرُ يَسْجُدَانِ The najm and the shajar both make sujood. So, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. To truly understand this verse, we have to unpack those 3 words. An-najmu wa shajaru yasjudan. What is a najm? What is a shajar? And what is yasjudan? What is sujud? What does it mean? They translate it sometimes as to prostrate, right? Yasjudan, to make sujud. So let's think a little bit about this. I want to go gradually through certain points and then kind of try to connect it all together. So number one, وَالنَّجْمُ وَالشَّجَرُ. Let's talk about those two words. An-najm and ash-shajar. Let's start with an-najm. What does an-najm mean? So an-najm, usually when we read najm in the Quran, we translate it as a star or stars, and the plural nujum, the stars. That's usually what we mean when we say najm. However, when it comes to this verse, there are certain scholars who interpret najm here differently. I don't lean towards their interpretation, but I at least want to share it with you because that is a potential way to think about this verse. But I want to also give you a different way to think about it. So what some of the scholars say when they say وَالنَّجْمُ وَالشَّجَرُ, the najm and the shajar. So shajar means trees, or at least that's how it's usually translated, trees. So what they say, some people say here, a najm doesn't mean stars, because if you look at the other verses, the things in the verse go together. So ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bihusban, the sun and the moon are according to exact calculations and exact reckoning. So then when you say an-najmu wash-shajaru, if here najm means a star or stars in general, how does that go? How does that coincide or go with trees, a shajar? So in their opinion, and this is not something I completely agree with or lean towards, but it is a interpretation that's given, so I want to share that with you. They go back to the linguistic meaning of the word najm. So the linguistic meaning of the word najm is explained in different ways, but basically revolves around yadullu ala tulu'in wa dhuhur. The linguistic meaning of the word najm, so in Arabic, the root of the word najm is dhahara wa tala'a, meaning something manifests and shows itself, right? And so how they explain that is that a shajar, trees, or a shajara is any plant growth that has like a trunk, and a najm is any plant growth that doesn't have a trunk, like a bush, right? So it appears, dhahara wa tala'a, it comes and it appears, just like the stars appear in the sky when we look at them. So that's one explanation that some people give to make this verse have balance between najm and shajar, just like the previous verse has a balance between ash-shamsu wal-qamar, the sun and the moon. That's one explanation. In studying it personally, I came to a slightly different conclusion, and Allah knows best. I wanted to give you the first explanation because that is a way that they explain it. But a different way to think about this is a najm actually does mean stars here, and then we ask ourselves, what's the connection here between the word najm, stars, and the word shajar, which is translated as trees? I'm going to explain that in a minute. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I want to give you, before I do, I want to tell you or share with you one of the reasons why. There's a couple reasons why I think the word najm here still means star, and the interpretation that's given sometimes that it means a type of plant that grows without a trunk is not necessarily, to me, fitting the context. But it could be, and Allah knows best. But here's why. So first of all, if you go through verses 1 through 4, right, and then you go after that to verse 5, 6, and beyond, you notice a really interesting phenomenon, right? And actually, the first couple times that we studied this surah, I didn't even pay attention to this, but it was in researching this that I found out, or that I noticed this particular observation. So notice the first 4 verses don't have the word and between them. In Arabic would be wa. So look, Ar-Rahman, allama al-Quran, khalaqa al-insan, allamahu al-bayan. Ar-Rahman taught the Quran, created the human being, taught him communication. Then the next, I should have said the first 5 verses, because the next verse also does not have wa at the beginning. It says, ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bihusban. The sun and the moon is by exact calculation. But notice after verse 5, now it starts to say and. وَالنَّجْمُ وَالشَّجَرُ يَسْجُدَانِ. And the najm and the shajar both prostrate. Verse 7, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانِ. And the sky or the heavens, he raised it. أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ, so that you don't transgress in the scale. وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنِ, and establish the weighing. And then if you go to verse 10, وَالْأَرْضَ, right, وَضَعَهَا, and the earth he placed it. for anam, al-anam. So if you look at the first 5 verses, right, this is really interesting. This is a really, really, really subtle point. But if you think about the flow of ideas here, this point really, thank you. It really helps to understand like the context a little bit more, and it's something that we can continuously unpack. So I'm not even saying like, I've solved all the reasons, but I want you to just notice this observation. From 1 to 5, there's no and in between them, right? So it's just stating fact after fact, but not necessarily connecting the facts together by saying and this and that. He's giving us independent facts, right? Ar-Rahman allama al-Quran, khalaq al-insan, allamahu al-bayan, ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bi-husban. Now, after verse 5, he starts connecting them together. Ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bi-husbanin wan-najmu wash-shajaru yasjudani was-sama'a rafa'aha. Right? The sun and the moon are, according to exact calculations, the najm and the shajar prostrate, and the heaven, he raised it. So, why is it that after verse 5, he starts using the word and? So, perhaps one thought about that is, this tells us that after like the first 5 verses, salam, he wanted us to just see each thing as an independent fact, right? Ar-Rahman, allama al-Quran, an independent fact. But after verse 5, he wanted us to see the connection and sequence of events between them. So, ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bi-husbanin wan-najmu wash-shajaru yasjudan. So, the sun and the moon are according to exact calculations, and the najm and the shajar both do sujud, or both prostrate. We'll say that for now. We're going to talk about that more. So that's number one. The number one, or the first observation for why personally I don't lean to that other explanation, that a najm here doesn't mean stars, it means plants without a trunk. That's one explanation people give. For me personally, I don't lean to that explanation because after verse 5, there's an and between them that shows a logical sequence of events. So it makes sense that after the sun and the moon, he would mention the stars. Ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bi-husbanin wan-najmu. And the najm, meaning the stars, perhaps. Okay, so to show why I say that makes sense is because if we go to other places in the Quran, we find a similar sequence. So, for example, he says in chapter 7, verse 54, he says, وَالشَّمْسُ وَالْقَمَرُ وَالنُّجُومُ مُسَخَّرَاتٌ بِأَمْرِهِ. That the sun and the moon and the stars are all subjected by his command. Right? And then if you go to 22:18, there's more to the verse, so I want to turn to it real quick. So if you go to 22:18, he says, now notice this verse we're studying in Surah Ar-Rahman mentions sujud, yasjudan, right? When najmu wa shajaru yasjudan, after the sun and the moon. So in verse 18 he says, Alam tara, of chapter 22 verse 18, Alam tara anna Allah yasjudu lahu. Do you not see that Allah yasjudu lahu, there makes sujud to him, man fis samawati wa man fil ard, whoever is in the heavens and the earth, wash-shamsu wal-qamaru wal-nujumu wal-jibalu wash-shajaru wal-dawab, as well as the sun and the moon and the stars, an-nujumu, and the mountains, and ash-shajaru. See how an-nujumu wash-shajaru is in the same verse after the sun and the moon and after talking about making sujud. So from those couple verses, to me, it makes sense that here, because of the wa in between them and the flow of ideas, that when he says ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bi-husbanin wan-najmu wash-shajaru, the najm is talking about the stars, right? Subhanallah, alhamdulillah, iyak. So from the flow of ideas, that makes a lot of sense, right? At least to me. And then, if you go through the rest of the sequence, right, from that verse, from verse 6, right, and you keep reading, it makes sense that a najm here is talking about the stars, because look at the flow of things that's being talked about. So if you look at Ash-Shamsu wal-Qamaru bi-Husban, the sun and the moon, wa-Najmu wa-Shajaru yasjudan, the stars and the Najm, the stars, and Ash-Shajar, we're going to talk about that word in a second, both do sujud. Was-Sama'a, then he goes to the sky or the heaven. And then when you get down to verse 10, he goes to wal-Arda, and the earth. And he's describing each thing. I'm skipping the description a little bit because right now I just want you to see the flow of ideas, right? That he's going from the sun, the moon, the stars, the sky, then the earth, and then he talks about what's in the earth, right? Wa alaikum salam. Inshallah, it may be a little bit longer today because I thought I had to work today, but my boss texted me and said I can take the night off, so I got a little extra time, inshallah. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, okay, so if you go through the sequence, right? So you go through the sun and the moon, an-najm, ash-shajar, then you get as-sama, make it all night. Then you go through as-sama, the heavens. Then you go to wal-ard in chapter 10 or verse 10, and then after that he starts talking about what is in the earth, like of plants and vegetation. He says, "Fiha fakihatun wan nakhlu dhatul akmam." It has fruits and has date palms. Wal habbu dhul asfi wal rayhan. We're gonna break down all these descriptions, but it's talking about like the vegetations. Alhamdulillah, it's talking about the vegetations and the seeds and all that type of stuff that grow in the earth. Okay, so if you go back up to verse 5 and 6, does it make sense logically, like from the sequence of ideas, that it starts with the sun and the moon, then it goes to an-najm, the stars, and then it goes to heaven and then earth, and then it talks about the vegetation in the earth? Does it make sense that najm here would mean, as some people explain, that it means like a type of plant without a trunk, right? To me, and Allah knows best, to me it doesn't follow the logical progression of ideas to explain it like that. Because it's starting with the sun and the moon, and then the najm, and then the sky, and then the earth, and then the vegetation in the earth. So the more logical, to me, explanation that fits the flow of ideas is that najm here means stars. Okay? Just like we would interpret it anywhere else in the Quran. As far as I'm aware, and Allah knows best, but as far as I'm aware, there's nowhere else in the Quran that we really make an argument that a najm or nujum, I mean, maybe someone else does, but as far as I'm aware, I've never seen someone make an argument that najm means other than stars, other than this place in the Quran. And it's only because it's connected with the word shajar, which is interpreted as trees, so they feel the need to reinterpret the word najm in order to keep the symmetry of the verse. But my question is, why don't we think the other way, right? Why don't we reinterpret the word shajar? How do we know the word shajar means trees? We're going to talk about that in a second. But I just want to show why, in my very humble opinion, the word najm here, it makes more sense to explain it as stars, because of the fact that if you look in other places in the Quran, the sun and the moon and the stars are coupled together, right? And here it's the sun, the moon, and then the stars. And then also, looking at the sequence of verses, you have the sun, the moon, the stars, the sky, the earth, and then the vegetation. So it doesn't quite make sense to me that the vegetation would be sooner mentioned in the surah when that actually comes later. And Allah knows best. So if that's true, if that's the case, then how does the word shajar, which is translated as trees, right? How does that fit into this context? Because now we maybe solve one problem in interpretation, but then we created another one, because they interpret najm as meaning a kind of plant in order to solve the interpretation problem of why is the word najm mentioned in the verse with trees. Okay, so here maybe it doesn't mean stars, it means a plant. That's their reasoning process. And I'm saying no, if you look at the sequence and if you compare it to other verses, najm seems to mean stars. Okay, then now we created the other problem. Well, then why is the stars with the trees, right? What is shajar? What does that mean? So let's think about this a little bit. So what if shajar doesn't actually mean trees? Because for one, when you look in the Quran, there is a precedence that the word shajara as a verb has a different meaning. So in chapter 4, verse 65, he said, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. So nay, by your Lord, they do not believe, they do not truly have faith. حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُوكَ فِي مَا شَجَرَ بَيْنَهُمْ. Until they make you a judge in all of the disputes that arise amongst them. So how I'm translating this, all of the disputes that arise amongst them, what is the Arabic form of that? Walaikum salam, that's okay. What is the Arabic form of that? Fima shajara bainahum. In what shajara, in what comes up as disputes bainahum, amongst them. So the idea of disputes coming up amongst them, this verse uses the word, walaikum salam, uses the word shajara, which we associate with trees. Why is that? Well, perhaps because if you just think about the idea of a tree, it kind of makes sense. A tree has these roots that go underground, and then it grows, then it branches out, as Allah describes it in Surah Ibrahim, asluha thabitun wa far'uha fis sama', that its asl, its root, is firmly established, and its branches reach to the heavens. Wa far'uha fis sama', right? So a tree, one of the descriptions of it in the Quran is something that branches out. And you know, the idea of a tree is found a lot in the Quran, the idea of different trees. So that's another study that we should do at some point, is just studying the idea of trees as metaphors and lessons in the Quran. Because you have the shajara with Adam, you have the shajara with Musa, fi buq'atil mubarakati min ash-shajara, right? It speaks about when Musa received the revelation, and he was fil buq'atil mubarakati min ash-shajara. He was in the blessed spot min ash-shajara, of the tree. Why was Adam, right? Why was there a shajara in the story of Adam, and in the story of Musa he's described as fi buq'atil mubarakati min ash-shajara, that he's in the blessed place min ash-shajara, in relationship to the tree. SubhanAllah. Yeah. So look at, there's shajaratu zaqum, there's the shajara of zaqum, and it's described as asluha aish al-ayah, the ayah slipped my mind, but takhruju fi asl al-jahim, that's it, takhruju fi asl al-jahim. Shajaratu zaqum, right, the tree of zaqum, alhamdulillah, is explained with a very interesting description. Takhruju fi asl al-jahim. It comes out in the root of jahim, the root of the fire. Like you would think, if you use the word kharaja to come out, you would think I would use the word min, from. Kharaja min, it comes out from. But he used the word fi, it comes out in. Takhruju fi asl al-jahim. Very interesting description. And that's talking about a jahim, like the hellfire and stuff like that. So obviously it's not like a tree that we know. It's something different. And even if you think of further descriptions of it, ru'usu tal'uha ka'annaha ru'usu shayateen, like its fruits, or tala, its tala is it's not exactly fruits, I don't remember the exact translation of it, but it's like the heads of shayateen, like the heads of devils. So what kind of tree is that? So when you start to think about the idea and the concept of a tree in the Quran, Allah compared a tree, gave us a metaphor or an analogy of kalimatan tayyiba. A good word is like a good tree. Alam tara kayfa daraba Allahu mathalan kalimatan tayyibatin kalimatan tayyibatan kashajaratin tayyibatin asluha thabitun wa far'uha fis sama'. Do you not see how Allah sets forth a parable? A good word is like a good tree. Its root is firmly established, and its branches reach to the heavens. So the tree here was a parable for kalimatan tayyiba, a good word, a pure speech, a pure concept. That was used as an example for, a tree was used as an example for that. So when you study the idea of a shajara, the shajara in the Quran, I think it's way deeper than, yes, I'm Muslim. I think it's way deeper than just the physical tree that we know. Yes, the physical tree that we know is the starting point for our contemplation, right? That's why Allah uses it perhaps as an example, because it's something we see around us. But we're not, I don't think, meant to stop at that and say, oh, it just means the physical tree. No, there's lessons in that physical tree. That's why he combined it with like a good word, and he combined it with all these different concepts, with Adam, with Musa. There's something deeper in the tree. So when we go to this verse, I think it was 465, right? Yeah, 465. And it's interesting that he made the word that he used. Listen to my boy Ben. I think it's interesting that that he used the idea of a tree as a verb, shajara, fima shajara bainahum. And if someone wanted to know about Islam, what should I do? If you could DM me, inshallah, I'll try to answer that. Just because we've been doing our lives like a class studying different surahs in the Quran, so I don't want to get off track. So if you have any questions like unrelated to the topic, then please DM me and I'll try to answer. But see, in this verse 465, he related shajara, like how they translated is fima shajara bainahum, in the disputes that arise amongst them. So fima shajara bainahum, that makes sense that that's used in that context because of the tree. We think of the tree as, number one, branching out. So when it comes to human relationships, that's exactly what happens. Fima shajara bainahum, there's all kinds of things that shajara bainana, that branch out between us when we interact, when we converse, when we talk about different ideas. There's all kinds of things that branch out between us, that come up between us, right? And also the idea of a tree is interesting in that context. Okay, I appreciate that. So the idea of a tree is interesting in that context too, because when you think about how a tree, there's this intertwining nature of it, right? Like you have all these branches and they have the leaves, and it like conceals things because there's all this like thickness like mixed together. So in the same way, that's how human relationships are, right? When we have these different human relationships, we discuss these ideas, we have these conversations. There's this intertwining of things where things aren't always clear. The actual like true perspective, or what's the more accurate perspective, is often hidden by all this branching out and all these leaves and all this vegetation that hides things. So this idea of, in this verse, fima shajara bainahum, they make you a judge in fima shajara bainahum, in what comes up between them, the disputes that come up between them. The fact that he used the word shajara, which is the verbal form of the same word as a tree, shajara as a noun, that's a really beautiful way of thinking about it. And also the fact that he used it like that, and all of the other ways that shajara is used in the Quran, as I just mentioned, it leads me, Allah knows best, to believe that we should open our minds up as far as what does the word shajara mean when we read it in the Quran. It doesn't just mean the physical trees that we see. So when we go back to this verse, thinking about all that, we go back to this verse 55:6, when najmu wa shajaru yasjudan. Could it mean conflict? Yeah, because all that mixing together and things intertwining, sometimes that leads to conflict, because we're connecting all these different things, and the true path, like even if you think about woods and like a forest and stuff like that, sometimes if it becomes thick, wa alaikum salam. You beat me to it. The shajara means the cluster of stars. I'm gone. I'm leaving. No, I'm just kidding. Man, you ruined my moment. No, I'm just joking. I'm joking. I'm glad you came to that conclusion, because that's also the conclusion I came to from studying it, is that if you look at these verses in sequence, right? Ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bihusban wan-najmu wash-shajaru yasjudan. The stars and the shajar both make sujud. So what's the connection? See, when people interpreted najm here as meaning a sort of like plant, right, that has no trunk, why did they interpret it like that? Because they couldn't see why a najm and a shajar was mentioned in the same verse. Because if shajar means trees, then why would stars be mentioned in the same verse? But like I said, if you follow the sequence, sun and moon, stars, the sky, the earth, and then the vegetation, it stands to reason that najm means stars, and a shajar here doesn't mean necessarily trees, but something tree-like. That's the word tree, or trees plural, is being used to give us a vivid description of something that we can think of as like a tree, or something in its structure is like a tree, but it's not necessarily a tree. And that's why the comment said clusters of stars, or maybe even galaxies, right? Inshallah. I'll try to summarize what we talk about in Surah Ar-Rahman and post it. But see, like, how that fits, right? Because you got the sun, the moon, the stars, and the shajar, perhaps the galaxies. Perhaps a shajar here means the galaxies, and there's so many interesting reasons why that could be the case. I actually wrote something down that I looked up, because I want to share with you from this example here. I want to share with you one of the things that I think is one of the beauties of the Quran, and I think it's one of the underappreciated things about the Quran, because I think when we go to the Quran many times, because of how we've been taught in our traditional Islamic education, but also our traditional religious education in general, with a lot of different religions and a lot of different backgrounds, we're taught to go to these scriptures, and we're taught to go to the Quran from the perspective of looking for a certain answer, right? Like, it has to be an absolute answer. So I have this question and I want to go to this book and I want this certain answer. But for me, that's not personally what I get from the Quran, that it's always supposed to just give me this concrete answer. What I think Allah knows best is one of the most underrated things about the Quran for me is that it is heuristic in its nature. Let me explain what I mean by that. Heuristic. So what is a heuristic? A heuristic in, like, cognitive science, when they study thinking and decision making and stuff like that, alhamdulillah, a heuristic is like a rule of thumb that leads us to a particular decision, but it's not a hard and fast rule, meaning it's just a rule of thumb, so it might not apply in every single situation, right? But it just kind of gives us like this general rule that if we apply it in a lot of situations, it's probably gonna lead us to a good decision. But there are also heuristics, rules of thumb, that every day at 2:00 Eastern Daylight Time, and the topic is Surah Ar-Rahman. So a heuristic, oh, right. I had to think about what you meant. Yeah, I got it now. Yeah, exactly. See a person with a hoodie approaching, that's kind of like a rule of thumb, right? You're like, oh man, but is that always right? No, that's not necessarily always right. So those are like rules of thumb that we learn, and there's a lot of studies about that, about the heuristics of decision making. There's some psychologists who specialize, like their whole career is specialized in studying our ways of thinking, our heuristics, okay? So for me personally, that's a good analogy. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's a good analogy to explain how I think about the Quran as heuristic in nature. Meaning, it's not necessarily going to tell us every single time this is the thing, but it's going to point us in a certain direction to research. So I'm going to give you a different example outside of the one we're talking about, and then we're going to come back to this one. So I was studying one time, and I noticed the similarity in two words in the Quran, the word for ant and the word for bee. So the word for ant is what? An-namal, namal, noon, mim, lam, or if we spelled it with English letters, it would be N-A-M-L, N-A-M-L, namal. That's the word for ants, like the insect. And then I noticed the word for a bee, right, is what? Nahl, N-A-H-L, or Nun Ha Lam. So that kind of hit me as interesting, because one of the beautiful characteristics of the Arabic language that you start to notice the more you study it is that there is a very intricate correlation between words in Arabic. Meaning, if words in Arabic have, wa alaikum salam, have almost the same letters, if they have all the same letters, there's a really strong relationship. But if they have almost the same letters, but maybe like one is different, you will notice many times there's a relationship in the meaning, right? So when I noticed this, I said, oh, a namal and a nahal is almost the same, except one has the meme in the middle, one has the ha in the middle, right? So that was heuristic to me. So I want to explain, I'm trying to explain why. Inshallah, DM me about that question. We'll talk about it. So I want to use this as an example to explain how the Quran is heuristic to me, how it points us in certain directions to research things further, but it's not necessarily telling us every single thing by the wording of it. So by me noticing the connection between Nahl and Namal, the word for bee and the word for ant, that they were almost the same except for one letter, that was heuristic to me, because that made me think there's a connection between that. I wonder what the connection is. So all I did was look up, Google, and just look up what is the connection between ants and bees. And what I found was amazing. What I found was from an evolutionary standpoint. So when you study taxonomy, like grouping all living things into these different groups, these different related groups, right? So the way that they used to do it when they first started organizing, our thought process about how all these biological organisms relate to each other, they used to do it in like more crude ways, like just through observation or noticing some similarities and stuff like that. But as technology advances, they start to do it with DNA. They start to look at what DNA is closer to what other animals, and then they group them according to DNA. So what I found about when I looked up what is the connection between bees and ants, that from an evolutionary standpoint, from the standpoint of DNA, they actually have they have a commonality. They're related in their DNA, more so than bees and like wasps, for example. And I never would have thought that. I never would have even considered that if I was just looking at it from the perspective of just looking at the natural world around me, and I saw a bee and I saw an ant. I would never have thought that they were connected from a genetic standpoint at some point in like evolutionary history. But because the Quran uses a very similar word with one letter difference, that was a heuristic for me to say, I believe there's something here. Let me just look this up. And I found some amazing things. And what's another amazing thing about it, if you think about the words, a namal with the meme, the M sound in the middle, namal, you can even, when you pronounce it, it's even heavier. It's a ground insect, basically. Well, there are flying ants, but basically when we see ants, usually we think about them on the ground. But the bee, which flies, notice how the middle letter is an airy kind of letter. Nahl. Isn't that beautiful? And that's the characteristics of the Arabic language too, that the words have relationships, but also the letters have implications. The sounds of the letters, how you pronounce the letters, they all have implications and meanings. Inshallah, peace. So that's what I mean when I say the Quran is, for me, not necessarily a book that's supposed to spell out every single thing, like do this and do that, subhanAllah, but rather it's heuristic, meaning it's going to give me these little hints and basically telling me, look, there's a clue here, look at this, study that, right? So why did I share all of that? Because I want to give that as an example to what happened to me when I was studying this verse, which is verse 6 of Surah Ar-Rahman. So when I was studying when Najmu wa shajaru yasjudan, for this, I was studying just today, preparing for this class today. So I first looked at the explanations for the word najm here, and I knew from my previous studies that some people explain this as like a plant, right? Because it's connected here with the word shajar, which they assume means trees. So I already knew about that, but I wanted to research it more because I wanted to go deeper into it and like see what the arguments were and do I agree with that. So once I started looking into it, and then I started studying more the sequence in the verses, and then I studied the other verses in the Quran that relate the sun and the moon and the stars in the same context, it was easier for me to conclude, like, no, here I think it does mean the sun, but then what does trees mean? So I'm like, what does shajar mean? So after playing around with a few different ideas, I Googled the relationship between trees and galaxies. And what I found was amazing. Like, I found so much stuff that there's other stuff that I need to go back and study because I'm not exactly clear. Like, I've heard of some of it before, but in the sense of like understanding it to the level of being able to convey it clearly, I don't feel like I have that good of a grasp of it. And I want to go back because I was doing it quick because there was so much, and I was preparing for this class, and it was already like 11:30, 12, and I thought I had to go to work. So I'm like, all right, well, let me just get a couple things just to share, and then I can come back and study the rest of this later. So, but I never would have done that. I never would have even looked that relationship up had I not noticed here that the word for stars and the word for shajar was connected together, which made me start to think that trees maybe were in reference to like galaxies, or like someone says star clusters or something like that. That was heuristic, meaning it pointed me in a definition to research something further. It didn't give me all the answers, but it made me think and made me want to study something further. But I wouldn't have maybe thought to study that. Oh, what was the surprise? I didn't mention the surprise yet. Inshallah, it's coming. It's coming soon. So I encourage you, marhaban bik, ahlan wa sahlan. So I wanted to share that because I think that's a way that we should cultivate thinking about the Quran, like using the concepts, the words, the verses of the Quran as heuristic in nature, meaning it's telling us. That's why, I mean, if you think about it, they're called what? They're called ayats. SubhanAllah. Inshallah, we're going to start some other stuff. They're called ayats. They're called signs, right? They're called signs, meaning, what does a sign do? A sign points you in a certain direction or gives you some direction, or like a stop sign or a street light or, a caution sign. It's giving you some direction, right? So in the same way, the verses and the concepts and the words of the Quran are ayats. They're signs that are pointing you in a certain direction, right? So an-najmu wash-shajaru. So I want to read one thing that I found. I wrote it down so I can remember it, how they said it. But this was really interesting. The relationship between between trees, the idea, and what I mean by trees and galaxies, I don't mean like the literal physical tree. I mean the idea of the tree, the concept and the things that relate to the tree. So they said that astronomers can read the rings in a galaxy's disk to unravel its past. This is called the inside-out theory of galaxy growth, which is just like we understand the rings of the tree to show its age, to show its past. So they've related the idea of studying galaxies to the same way that we understand the age of trees. And they call this the inside-out theory of galaxy growth, right? Reading the inner rings of the galaxy to unravel its past. And they said bursts of star formation in central regions were followed by I think it was 1 or 2 billion years later. I'm sorry, I think I wrote that down wrong. By star birth in the outer fringes. So the star formation in the central regions were followed like 1 or 2 billion years later with star birth in the outer regions, meaning the production of stars went from inwards to out. Wa alaikum salam. Similar to how we study the growth of a tree. And that's just one thing. That's just one thing that connects trees, the idea of trees and the idea of stars. But also something that we can go a lot deeper about is when you look into like fractals and Fibonacci's number. The Fibonacci, it's not the Fibonacci sequence. I think it's Fibonacci's number, but it relates to that because it relates to the repetition of patterns. SubhanAllah, it relates to the repetition of patterns from the smallest thing. They call them fractals. So, for example, the leaves on a tree, when you see like the little veins in it, they look like little trees. So on every level, these are called fractals, that there's this self-similarity